This video is all about hyperglycemia and the three sort of classic signs and symptoms of hyperglycemia that you will read about and hear talked about. I'm also going to talk about insulin, the different classes of insulin and some of the names of the insulin in the different classes. And I'm also going to talk about empagliflozin, which is an oral anti-diabetic, because it's just going to fit really nicely into the diagram I'm going to draw. So hyperglycemia, high blood sugar. We care about that because chronically elevated glucose damages blood vessels, and that's going to lead to kidney disease, retinopathy, cardiovascular disease. So we don't want people's blood sugars to stay too high for long periods of time. When your blood sugar is too high, there's going to be three classic signs and symptoms: peeing a lot, being really hungry, and being really thirsty. That's what these words mean. So let's start with polyuria, peeing a lot. To understand this, I have to draw out our Bowman's capsule and our nephron. So there we have Bowman's capsule and our proximal convoluted tubule here, the loop of Henle, our distal convoluted tubule. Just a simple diagram to understand these, but you get the point. And then the collecting duct. And that's where the filtrate gets turned into urine and we pee it out. Feeding Bowman's capsule, we have the afferent arteriole, efferent arteriole, leaving it. So here we have afferent, and here we have efferent. Okay, so blood is traveling through the afferent arteriole and eventually it gets to Bowman's capsule. And that blood is kind of, you can think of it as being poured into Bowman's capsule. It travels through the nephron, through the proximal convoluted tubule. And traveling through the nephron, the body decides what substances are going to get reabsorbed and what substances are we going to let go of and let this person pee out, let them get turned into urine. In the proximal convoluted tubule, your body decides it's going to pull back glucose. So there's transporters here in the proximal convoluted tubule, and they are called SGLT2 transporters. They reabsorb about 90% of filtered glucose. There's another transporter, and it's a little bit later in the proximal convoluted tubule, and it's called SGLT1, and it absorbs the remaining 10% of glucose. So your body was built to hold on to as much glucose as it can because glucose is an energy source. So your body does not want to give up an energy source. So up to a certain point, all the glucose that you eat is going to be reabsorbed through these transporters, and it's going to go back into your systemic circulation for your cells to grab up using insulin. So that's what normally happens. Now, when these transporters reach a certain limit, and the limit is reached once your blood glucose is about 10 millimoles per liter, or about 180 milligrams per deciliter, somewhere around there. They are totally saturated. You can't reabsorb any more glucose through these transporters, either one of them, when your blood sugar gets about that high. So then that's when the glucose starts traveling through the rest of this system, getting to the collecting duct, and you start spilling glucose in your urine. And that's why spilling glucose in your urine is a sign of very high blood sugar, because it means these transporters are totally saturated. They can't take any more back into systemic circulation. Okay, so where does the polyuria come in? Well, glucose is osmotically active. So here's some molecules of glucose. And osmotically active just means that water likes to follow it. Water is going to try and dilute it. Water likes to go where there's a lot of particles and dilute. So that means if you have a lot of glucose moving through the nephron and into the collecting duct, that means you're going to have a lot of water moving through the nephron and into the collecting duct because it's just following the glucose. So that's where the polyuria comes from. And we care about polyuria because so much fluid can start following this glucose that you can actually get electrolyte imbalances, fluid volume deficits. And if things get really severe, this osmotic shift can actually pull water out of cells, including brain cells. So let's imagine I have a brain cell over here, and there's a certain amount of particles in the brain cell, and there's a certain amount of particles surrounding the brain cell. Now, when you get a lot of particles surrounding this cell, for example, a lot of glucose surrounding this cell, water is going to do what water does best, which is shift. Leave the cell to try and dilute. And now this cell is shrinking. It's lost fluid. It's lost volume. And this cell is not going to work quite as well as it could or should. So those are the reasons that we care about polyuria, and that's why it happens. Let's mention an oral anti-diabetic med, because with this diagram, it's a good place to talk about it. It's called Empagliflozin. I'm going to write that out. Empagliflozin. Okay, so we know glucose goes into the filtrate. It gets reabsorbed using these SGLT2 transporters. Empagliflozin blocks these transporters. It only blocks SGLT2. I shouldn't say only, because SGLT2 is responsible for 90% of the glucose getting pulled back. It doesn't block SGLT1, this remaining 10%. So that's what this oral anti-diabetic does. It makes it so that you're not reabsorbing glucose, and you might actually get a mild diuretic effect from empagliflozin. And now we can understand why, because we have more particles of glucose reaching the collecting duct. So that's polyuria. That's one of the signs of hyperglycemia. That's why we care about it. All right, let's get into polydipsia, which is being extremely thirsty. So I'm going to draw out a picture of the brain, and we'll put the hypothalamus right there, and we'll put the pituitary gland right there, the anterior and the posterior pituitary gland. So right there we have the hypothalamus. And right here we have the pituitary. Inside the hypothalamus, there are neurons that actually sense how concentrated our blood is. They are called osmoreceptors. So we can just imagine that our osmoreceptors are like this, and they are always sensing how many particles are in our blood, how concentrated our blood is. And these particles could be glucose, they could be sodium. They don't necessarily have to be glucose, but in this example they are. So when we have a lot of glucose floating around, these osmoreceptors notice it. And there's kind of two things that can happen next, and usually they happen simultaneously. A message can get sent to the thirst center and tell the person to start drinking water. Tell them to become really thirsty so that they start drinking water. And that's what the polydipsia is that it's a message sent from the osmoreceptors that live in the hypothalamus to the thirst center of the brain to tell the person with this really high blood sugar to start drinking. So that's one plan that the body has when your blood becomes very concentrated. So I'll put a 1 right next to osmoreceptors. There's a second plan that your body has. The hypothalamus can send a message to the pituitary gland and tell the pituitary gland, I'll put an arrow here, tell the pituitary gland to release ADH, antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin. This vasopressin travels through the bloodstream, and eventually it's going to get to the nephron, get through Bowman's capsule, travel through the nephron, and get to the distal convoluted tubule. And it's basically, long story short, going to tell the distal convoluted tubule to release water and the peritubular capillaries to reabsorb water. Let's get more water in the bloodstream so that the blood isn't so concentrated with particles. Now, in osmotic diuresis, that doesn't work. The osmotic diuresis, the power of the glucose to pull water along with it to the collecting duct, overpowers the ADH, overpowers the vasopressin, so that doesn't happen. So all we are left with is the polydipsia. The person's kind of stuck in a loop. They are losing fluid from the polyuria. They get thirsty, they drink, but they keep losing fluid. So that is polyuria and polydipsia. Now I'm going to erase our nephron here so that I can explain polyphagia, which is being extremely hungry. So for most people, the majority of people, the energy source of their cells is glucose. So here we have a cell, and it's surrounded by glucose. Cells cannot uptake glucose without insulin. Insulin attaches to the cell, and it creates a series of responses in the cell that basically the cell opens up a door and lets glucose in, lets the energy source in. Without insulin, you can't let this particular energy source into the cell. Now, what if you don't have insulin because you don't know that you are diabetic, you don't know that you're insulin resistant, or you have misdosed your insulin, or whatever the case might be? The cell is surrounded by an energy source, but it can't see it. It thinks it's starving. And actually, the reality is that it is starving because it can't get the energy source. So I'm going to draw the brain again under polyphagia with the hypothalamus. A signal gets sent up to the hypothalamus that the cells are starving for energy. And then the hypothalamus sends a message to the hunger center of the brain and alerts the person that they are very hungry. It tells the person to be very hungry. And that's what polyphagia is. So polyphagia is actually going to play a role in making the other two problems worse, because let's say the person starts eating a lot of food. Their glucose is just going to build up in the bloodstream. And that means they're going to spill more glucose in the urine. And it means that their blood is going to become more concentrated. So the polydipsia is going to become more of a problem. So these things really exist in a feedback loop. Okay, let's review that and draw out everything that we've learned about these things. Just make some room here. Okay, so we have a person that is either insulin resistant, let's say. Let's take an insulin resistant person to understand this. So in insulin resistance, we have a cell here, and let's imagine that in the average person, it takes one insulin to tell one cell to let in one glucose. And the relationship is like that in the average person. In an insulin resistant person, it takes much more insulin to let in one glucose into one cell. The cell doesn't respond to insulin as well as it could or should. So that means if you don't have enough insulin, because let's say your beta cells are getting exhausted, your pancreatic beta cells are getting exhausted, or maybe you misdosed your insulin that morning, or whatever the case might be, we don't have the insulin that we need to let the glucose into the cells. So the glucose starts building up in the bloodstream. Okay, now we have some very, very, very concentrated blood. We are over the renal threshold. Our transporters cannot reabsorb any more glucose, and it's going to be somewhere above 10 millimoles per liter, 180 milligrams per deciliter. So the polyuria happens first, typically, and then the polyphagia and the polydipsia start happening. The polydipsia, because our thirst centers are activated. Simultaneously, ADH is being released, but the osmotic diuresis is overcoming the ADH. And what is also happening is our cells are sending a message to our brain that they are starving. They need energy. One way to get energy is to eat. If the person starts eating, well, that blood sugar can get even higher, but the person is still in an energy crisis unless they get insulin to basically unlock the cell to let the glucose in. And if things get really serious, your body can switch to an alternate fuel source, which is ketones, to feed the cells. And ketones don't need insulin to get into the cells for the cells to use them as energy. And I'll make a separate video about diabetic ketoacidosis. Okay, so those are the big three signs and symptoms of hyperglycemia. Now let's start talking about insulin, that is best known for getting glucose inside of cells. That's not the only thing that insulin does. For example, you can't store fat without insulin. You can't grow your fat cells without insulin. You can't put glycogen and fat into the liver without insulin. It has many different roles in the body. But in this video, we're just discussing it as its job to put glucose into cells. So as part of your licensure exam in both Canada and the United States, as part of the test plan to know the onset, the peak, and the duration of different insulins. So I'm going to build a chart to teach you the different classes of insulins and, very roughly speaking, the onset, the peaks, and the durations. Every brand is going to have a different number. Every person is going to respond a little bit differently to the dosage of insulin that you give them, depending on how sensitive or insensitive that they are. But I've kind of kept this chart in my head for the past 12 years of being a nurse, and it's never steered me wrong. So I'll teach this to you just to have a general idea of the onset, peaks, and durations of the different insulin you're going to give. There's 4 classes of insulin: rapid, short, intermediate, just shorten that to intermediate, and long. The rapid-acting insulins are gololicine, Aspart, and Lispro. Short-acting insulins, Humulin R, intermediate-acting Humulin N, and the long-acting Lantus, also known as glargine. And I'm writing out both names for it here because I don't want you to get glargine and gololicine mixed up. People get those mixed up a lot. Wherever you work might have different names, brand names, but this is just to get you started to be able to list the insulins in each class. Now, for the onset, peak, and duration, to build this chart, you just have to remember the number 15. The onset of the rapid actings is roughly 15 minutes. Now, remember, this chart's very general. So some resources might say, well, actually, Aspart is 10 minutes, and actually Lispro is 12.5, and gololicine is 14. That's okay. We're just starting to learn these numbers, so we're just going to learn them in general, and then we can get more detailed as we learn them. To get the peak, we double the onset for the rapids, and to get the duration, we double that, 15, 30, 60, very general numbers. Short acting, to get the numbers for short acting, we just double the numbers down instead of across. So the onset, roughly 30 minutes, the peak, roughly 60 minutes, and the duration, roughly 120 minutes. Of course, making exceptions for different brands and everything else. For intermediate acting, all you have to remember is the number 1/8, 1 hour, 8 hours, 1/8. 1 hour, 8 hours, 18 hours, 1/8, 1/8. That's intermediate acting. And long acting is the easiest of all because you just have to remember the number 1. It works within roughly 1 hour. There is no peak for the long acting, and it lasts roughly 1 day. So that is in general the onset, peak, and duration of the different classes of insulin. Now, like I said, there's going to be variations with every brand and every person and every resource that you read. But I found this helpful just to start memorizing the details. To memorize details, you have to start with memorizing the general rules and then get deeper into the details. Some other things I want you to know about insulin: Humulin R is the only one that you can give IV. So you can give it both sub-Q and IV, but it's the only one you can give IV. And Lantus is the insulin you cannot mix with any other insulin. So just a couple other important rules to know about. All right, that's a review of hyperglycemia, why those 3 classic symptoms happen, and an introduction to insulin and an introduction to a method as to how to memorize the onset, peaks, and durations of different insulins.